and I was sitting against a convenience store, and I all of a sudden became cognizant that I was going to die permanently. I wasn't afraid of a physical death, but that's obvious by the way I was living. But all of a sudden, I became horribly afraid of a spiritual death, a permanent death. And I leaned against this convenience store, and with all the stuff that was in my system, I had a moment of sobriety. And I prayed openly to heaven, and I hadn't prayed for years. And I begged Heavenly Father to save me.
Welcome to Meridian Magazine's How I Know podcast. This is Scott and Maureen Proctor, and we are delighted to be with you again this week.
And this week we have a wonderful guest with a special story. His name is James Henry Moyle III, and he came from a wonderful, strong background, and he tells a story from there.
Hi, it's so nice to be with you, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be able to tell this story. I just want to preface up front that it's sometimes hard to tell, and it's not always comfortable for me to tell, but it's important for me to tell it straight and honestly and be completely transparent about every part of it. I come from a wonderful heritage, as all of us do, really. You know, we come from tough people, and the Moyle line of my family was converted to the church in England. My great-great-great-grandfather, John Rowe Moyle, and his wife, and my great-great-grandfather, James Moyle, which, by the way, there's a James all the way to my son, James, every single generation in a row. And it's just kind of kept that pioneer tradition alive in us, because we hear these stories about, on every side of our family, about these tough people anyway, the Moyles, they converted in England, and John Rowe Moyle was a seventh degree stonemason, and his son James was an apprentice with him when they were converted. And like so many thousands of families, they made their way across the ocean, which I can't imagine what that was like, but the stories of them coming across the plains just baffle me sometimes, that they were able to overcome what they did. And as my parentage came into the valley and saw what was going on with the temple at that time, the construction had barely started. Once they were settled, John Rowe Moyle was immediately the head stonemason, because nobody else knew as much as he did, or at least that's what I understand. And so he was basically the general contractor. The Lord was the general contractor, but he was certainly an important tool in the Lord's hand to continue that work and to pick up where it had kind of been left off when Johnson's army came into town. They had to bury the foundation. You know the stories. He was asked by Brigham Young to settle Alpine, and so he walked back and forth after he built a home in Alpine and a stone fort to protect themselves from the Indians down there at the time. And then he would walk that 22 miles back to the temple site and stay with his son James and his family during the week, and then go home to Alpine on weekends. And one weekend he was kicked by a cow when he was trying to milk a cow, and it horribly fractured his leg, and they had to tie him to a door and cut his leg off with a bucksaw. And I can't imagine what that was like, but he whittled himself a leg eventually, and started walking around the yard in it, and eventually started walking around the farm with it. And woke up one Monday morning, and his wife said, "What are you doing? Why are you packing?" And he says, "Well, my call to continue to help build the temple has never ceased. I've got to go." So for years he did that, and he died about 3 years before it was completed. And the very last thing that he did before he passed away, so he was there for, I think, 36 or 37 years of that project. He carved that gold plaque on the east side of the temple up high underneath the angel Moyle. It says, "Holiness to the Lord. This is the house of the Lord." And his son James always knew where he was, because he could hear that stump, clomping around on the scaffolding up there. And anyway, they were very close, and it's just amazing what they all did. And I just come from a great family, like all of us really do. And my grandfather was a wonderful man, and his wife, Louise Covey, and they ended up doing just working hard and being successful. And where Third Ave continues up, turns into Penrose Drive in the east part of Salt Lake there, that ended, and there were just wheat fields beyond that. And he bought the very last lot there and built a home for his wife there. And my father came home from his mission to that home, and it's right up there in the Federal Heights area where I grew up. And years later, my dad bought a home just down the street from it, and that's where I was raised. I was very privileged, had every opportunity. Scholastics came easily for me, as did most sports, and that kind of became a curse to me that things would come easily for me.
So, James, with all of this privilege, and you had every opportunity, and I remember you said to us early on when we were talking before the show that you could pretty much do athletics, do anything you wanted to, but you really were turned on by adrenaline, by getting an adrenaline rush, by doing wild things and crazy things, and that really was your thing. Tell us more about that. How did that all come about, and how did that lead your life along?
What it did for me, Scott, is it just gave me a rush. It made me feel good. I felt almost invincible. Boy, let me tell you, I biffed it a lot of times too, and I got beat up too. I mean, getting involved in those adrenaline sports was not always a positive thing, but for some reason, it really gave me a high and just made me feel on top of the world. And I was skydiving by the time I was 15, and doing backflips off cliffs on skis, and riding my motorcycle up all those foothills, and sometimes watching the motorcycle roll back down the mountain, and figuring out how I could mow a bunch more lawns and replace the parts that I broke and keep doing it. And unfortunately, I wasn't always the greatest kid. I would get in a lot of fights and just was not the most Christ-like person. But I had a great family, and they just always encouraged me to do better and to push through school, and I knew that there was something incredible about the church because I always felt good when I was around it, but I didn't have a lot of patience to want to read the Book of Mormon like some of my friends did. And I don't know, I just was distracted by all this adrenaline stuff. And so, that kind of behavior comes with problems. Like, I had my first knee surgery when I was 15. And let me tell you what, when I felt codeine in my system, I thought, my goodness, I can take a handful of codeine and feel that same adrenaline rush because it hits the same receptor site in your brain as adrenaline. And so I found a new love, and I didn't know it at the time, but that's exactly what happened. And I'd experimented as a preteen with drugs and alcohol, but that codeine for me did something. And I kind of hit it as best I could through high school, but when I could get it, I'd take it. And eventually graduated from high school, went to college, and was in a fraternity at the U. And that's kind of a license to party for a guy like me. And I kind of started to live a duplicitous life at that time. And, I really thought that I should go on a mission. I felt like it was my duty, but I didn't have a testimony of it. And I had an incredible bishop at that time, just an incredible man. His name is Craig Meacham, and he doesn't like me to talk about him a lot, but I have to do it because he really influenced me. And I said, Bishop Meacham, I've never read the Book of Mormon. Would you read it with me? And he would read the Book of Mormon with me weekly. He would literally come down into my room some mornings when I wouldn't show up and say, hey, we're reading. And he just convinced me that it was the right thing to do. And just being around this man, that his spirit was incredible. And so eventually I was able to get my papers in and straighten up enough to where I could get a mission call. And I went to Brazil, and I absolutely loved it. I was in Rio de Janeiro, and I fell in love with the people of Brazil, and I really enjoyed my mission and was successful. But I came back to that same element that I spoke of. And a lot of my fraternity brothers went on missions too. And most of those gentlemen came back, and they were true blue. They stayed honest and true to their convictions. And I fell into that group that didn't keep all of those commandments, especially the word of wisdom. And that was really the only one that I struggled with. And I would hide it. And, I ended up in jail a few times for assaults and things like that, just dumb fraternity stuff, but it started to set a pattern for me of this duplicity got even stronger, and I would hide things, and eventually I'd get caught. I used to go out and get chases with the University of Utah police. We'd always get in trouble with them and get chased, and that was a great adrenaline rush for me, and it happened many, many times, and they never did catch me, but I was so dumb. My license plate said JHM the third on it, so they knew it was me, and I had people that would cover for me, and an attorney in the ward that would always get me out of a jam. But a couple times when I landed in jail, I had to do something to show them that I was, willing to not do those things anymore. And because I was always drunk when something like that would happen, I did a couple of rehabs to get out of having a felony on my record. And I just continue to have people cover for me and enable me. And, my big weaknesses are in humility and entitlement. And unfortunately, I thought I was better than everybody else and that I could get away with those things. But eventually I graduated from college and I went to BYU to graduate school. And at that point in my life, I started really getting into rock climbing. And the rock climbing got to a point where I was afraid that, I might die doing it because we were doing big wall stuff. And so I straightened up. I really did. For the first time in my life, I really was straight, like I was on my mission. And at that point, I met my former wife, and just an incredible woman. And by that point, I was into high altitude mountaineering, and I'd climbed some of the highest mountains in the world. And she came from an incredible family, the Flake family and the Giles family from Arizona, and just I was so lucky. I married way up, and she was so patient with me. Even though she was 8 years my junior, she was spiritually more mature than I was. And we eventually ended up going back to Harvard as visiting graduate students and built a beautiful home in the Provo Hills and had horses and toys and had 4 incredible kids. And off and on, I struggled with this duplicity, and I would have a surgery and the doctor gave it to me. So that's okay. Biggest lie ever. And I lied to myself. I really knew better, but I was too big of a coward to admit it. What I really wanted was those drugs from time to time because I knew what they did for me. And had some great business success and was a real estate developer. And eventually, with more surgeries and more addiction, I was on the strongest in every category, the strongest Oxycontin you can possibly get, the strongest amount of benzodiazepines, Valium, those type of drugs, muscle relaxers. And, I didn't have to. I mean, some guys would go out and you would think that you'd just go out and start really partying and stuff. No, I didn't have to, because what I had was stronger than anything that I could have gotten on the street or buying in a store. The doctors just fed me with stuff like that, and they started putting titanium in my body. I got a titanium plate in my neck, and boy, I sure milked that one. It almost killed me a few times, and it scared me, but I couldn't quit. It was horrible. I just couldn't quit. And I buried, what was once a great testimony. And I was a great father and a great husband for many years, but I buried that too with that addiction. And eventually my business partners had to invite me to leave. And then my wife finally did. And they should have all done it sooner. I was a mess. They loved me and they enabled me. But when my wife asked me to leave, and I couldn't be with my kids, and I just became an even bigger coward, and I landed on the streets, literally a needle in my arm for the next 5 years, absolutely spending 100% of my effort on putting so much in that needle that it wouldn't kill me, but I'd be right on that razor's edge. and I did die a few times. They brought me back in the back of an ambulance. Did you have a question, Maureen?
Yes, I have a question. So there was no in between point between being at home as a husband and father and landing on the street. I mean, how do you land on the street? Is it just that you want the stuff so much?
Yes, I was we built a beautiful home, and we built one up in Brighton as well, right on the ski resort. But when I was asked to leave, and we'd lived happily for over 20 years, but when I was asked to leave, I left my former spouse everything, bank accounts, everything. I just left, and I went and started getting it wherever I could, because I certainly couldn't get it from doctors anymore. I landed on the streets. I became completely homeless by choice, and I didn't want anybody to find me. And I immediately found methamphetamine and heroin mixed together is one of the most powerful things on the planet. As a matter of fact, I don't know what is more powerful. And I was immediately allowed myself to get sucked into the hardest of hardcore addictions. And I literally was on that razor's edge of dying. And I did die. I died in the back of an ambulance. I died in a hotel room once, and they kept bringing me back, narking me, they called it. Or they would throw me in a bathtub with a bunch of ice and slap me until I'd come to. And 5 years just went like that. I can't believe how fast it went. But I was so incredibly numb that I just lost years. I was permanently kicked out of the road home. Now it's torn down, but it's pretty hard to get permanently kicked out of the road home. And this all happened in my 50s. And I was kicked out of the rescue mission. I tried to go through their little program, and I used, after I did what's called working out, where you go and get a job, and they caught me and they kicked me out. And I just kept landing back on the streets, and I had to fight for my existence. You have to when you're on the streets.
James, did shame play a role in your decisions and in your staying? Because you said a minute ago that you really didn't want anyone to find you. Did shame play a role?
Wow, that's an incredible question, because shame is what was killing me. And shame was the biggest thing that I had to overcome. So that's very intuitive of you to ask that question. And the shame was so bad when I wasn't high that that's what made me want to go out and do the next caper. I became a petty thief. I had all kinds of hustles to try to get money. And I became a very dishonest person to be able to do all of that. And I was sitting against a convenience store up in Sugar House, and I all of a sudden became cognizant that I was going to die permanently. I wasn't afraid of a physical death, but that's obvious by the way I was living. I did die a few times, but all of a sudden I became horribly afraid of a spiritual death, a permanent death. And I leaned against this convenience store, and with all the stuff that was in my system, I had a moment of sobriety. I was blessed with a moment of sobriety. I guess I should say it like that. And I prayed openly to heaven, and I hadn't prayed for years. And I begged Heavenly Father to save me. I begged Heavenly Father for the right to someday be able to be with my children again. It's crazy that I wouldn't have realized that over those years, but I was so numb that I really couldn't realize it. And so as I ended that prayer, it was not that long after that happened that same bishop that probably saved me from at least a wheelchair when I was 18 and got me on a mission, that same man, Craig Meacham, just happened to walk up, and I couldn't believe it. I stood up and I said, "Meacham," and he looked at me, and of course he couldn't recognize me. I'd lost 100 pounds, and I had a beard and ratty clothes, and I stunk, and I was probably bloody. And he said, "Who are you?" And I said, "It's James Moyle." He just grabbed me. He just grabbed me and wouldn't let go. And for that brief moment, I was not ashamed, because I knew I was being hugged by someone that truly loved me. And he said, what can I do for you? I know what you are capable of. Come and see me in my office, and please let's get you back on track. And he went home and told his wife, and his wife said, "What? Let's go get him. He'll be gone." They haven't been able to find him for years. And so they came back and got me, and miraculously, I was in the same place because I didn't stay in the same place for 9 seconds. And I was always on the move. And they said, "We want to take you home." And I said, "How are you going to even put me in your car?" And they said, "We don't care about that." And so they took me home, and I don't know how many razors I used and how many showers I took, and they burned my clothes. And the next morning, they put me in a hotel, and I couldn't flip the switch that fast, Scott and Maureen. I just couldn't do it. And I tried to go in, and he tried to help, get me working with him. He was a very prolific real estate developer in the Sugar House area and had plenty of work that I could have done. But I couldn't flip the switch. And the hotel finally kicked me out after about 10 days. And he said, "Listen, there's this place called the Other Side Academy, and it's doing miraculous things. And will you please let me take you there?" And so he took me there, and I went to the Other Side Academy in downtown Salt Lake on First South and 7th East. And I sat on the bench and I looked at their beliefs, which is just the gospel of Jesus Christ packaged in a format that somebody like me could understand, because I was that bad. And the Other Side Academy is for the chronically homeless, incarcerated, and addicted. It works for people when absolutely nothing else works. And I sat on the bench and I looked at those beliefs, and boy, shame hit me like a ton of bricks. And I was a coward, and I left. And I got hit by a car. I woke up in the ICU at the U with my mouth wired shut for the next 4 months, braces on both legs, and it took me a full year in a rehabilitation center to become ambulatory again, where I could walk back into the Other Side Academy with a little humility. And this is how Bishop Meacham got me back. He kept coming and visiting me, sometimes alone and sometimes with his wife. He got my kids involved. He loved me back to the Other Side Academy. And he knew I didn't want to go. And he said, "James, you have to come meet Joseph Grenny, one of the main founder of the Other Side Academy. They're wrapping presents for the students at the Other Side Academy up at our old ward in Federal Heights. Will you come?" And I couldn't tell him no, because he'd already done so much for me, and I'd prayed for help. And I was so depressed, but he got me up there, and he introduced me to Joseph, and I met some of the staff members. And on the way home, Bishop Meacham could tell that I wasn't committed to wanting to go back. And he said, "James, I want to drive you by where Joseph and Sheila Granny are building their home in our old neighborhood." And he drove me several blocks down towards where I grew up. And he drove by and pointed to where Joseph and Sheila were rebuilding their home. And my jaw dropped. I couldn't believe it, because the home that they had purchased and torn down and were rebuilding on that same property at 1436 Penrose Drive was first built by my grandpa James and my grandma Louise Covey Moyle. And my grandma and grandpa, as the story goes, gifted it to Harold B. Lee, the prophet of the church at that time. I just couldn't believe it. As a real estate developer, I knew what chain of title looked like on that property. And I knew that the Lord was parting the Red Sea for me. And Bishop Meacham told me the Lord was parting the Red Sea for me. And so I ended up going back to the Other Side Academy with a little humility this time, realizing that there is no way that the world is that small, and that I was being led to go back and to go through this process. And so I went back to the Other Side Academy, and it's raw and in your face. The average jail/prison stay for each student at the Other Side Academy is in the mid-20s. I mean, it literally is a pretty hardcore group that have tried everything else and nothing else has worked. And every person down there knows somebody that's died or somebody that's in prison for life. And like I mentioned, it's raw and in your face, and you can't get away in our therapeutic community with bad behavior because we can't fool each other. And the process is incredible how it works. It's intense accountability. It's intense honesty. It's really hard work. The Other Side Academy is built on a model that comes from Delancey Street, and all the senior members of the staff at the Other Side Academy were former staff members at Delancey Street. And the model works this way: we take no government funding or insurance subsidies whatsoever. And it's free for people to go there and to save their lives. How does that happen? It happens with self reliance. The Other Side Academy runs social enterprises that fund the development of the next student being able to come and have their life saved. We have the #1 rated moving company in Utah. And you think of the cast of characters that I just explained to you coming in and moving your most precious belongings in your house. And people tell their friends about the Other Side Academy and the movers. You've got to use them. And they're saying, are you kidding me? I'm not going to let those guys in my house. And they say, no, have them come and do it. We've had the movers come and move us several times. And these guys get in there and they run to the truck and they grab the next piece of furniture and they bring it in the house and they run back to the truck. And of course, there's no smoke breaks. And they run like crazy until the job is complete, even if it's 2 days. They don't stop. And if they ding a wall, they say, oh, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, we dinged your wall. We're so sorry. They're completely accountable. So our process in our therapeutic community goes into every part of what we do. And it's super cool how it works. We have 2 Salt Lake best rated thrift stores, a construction company, and now a storage company to help the people that we move. They asked us, gosh, we need to be able to store our things. And so we just keep growing. We've got a campus in Denver. And the secret sauce behind how it came together was Joseph Grenny was writing a book called Influencer, and he was led to the person that started Delancey Street. And he bookmarked that. He's like, wow, I can't believe that this group of people is coming together and they're staying straight. And as he had business success and some time and money to be able to do something, to be able to give back, he came up with this idea and got his wife involved and got some key people involved. And they found this incredible man that had gone through Delancey Street by the name of Dave DeRocher. And Dave DeRocher spent half his life in prison. He grew up with some privilege too, but he got addicted to meth at a young age and addicted to adrenaline and addicted to guns and whatever else it was that fed him. And he spent half his life in prison. And he's the kind of leader that wherever he was, he led the yard in prison, for example. And he'd get out and he'd go back in. He'd get out and he'd go back in. And this judge was getting ready to sentence him to 24 years to life for his last offenses. And the judge probably said to himself, I'm probably crazy, but there's this place called Delancey Street, and it only will take you 2 years, Mr. DeRocher. And if you can do it, and I don't know if you can, but I see something in you. If you can do it, you'll not only you won't have any more of a sentence, you won't even have parole. But it's so hard that good luck. And if you leave, you're going to jail, you're going to prison for the rest of your life. And so Dave DeRocher went through this process and found that it was extremely difficult. And when he got to the 2-year mark where he would have been free, like all the other times when he was free, he made a different choice this time and said, well, can I stay longer? And he knew he could stay longer. People can stay at Delancey Street now at the Other Side Academy for as long as they want until they feel like they're strong enough to be able to go back into society. Dave DeRocher ended up staying 8 years and ended up being the executive director of the LA location. And so when Joseph Grenny came calling, he said, absolutely. He had finally taken a job and was doing very well up in the oil fields. And he missed the fact that he wasn't saving lives anymore. And so when he was asked to come start the Other Side Academy, he took a drastic cut in pay and said, absolutely, I'll do it. Let's go build it. I want that feeling of saving other people's lives again. The Other Side Academy saved my life.
So let me ask you a question. How have you learned to access the Lord's atonement? for all the many things that you've been involved in over the years that were destructive to you and to others. Because I think accessing the Lord's atonement is an absolute must in order to become a new person.
I thought I understood the atonement before, but I did not. I didn't realize that I could have the Savior as my partner, that He could do the rest of the work for me that I wasn't able to do for myself. And so I really didn't have spiritual confidence. And like Scott pointed out, I struggled with shame. And that was the biggest thing that the Other Side Academy helped me overcome. Shame is simply a tool of the adversary. It is not in the Lord's tool belt. So I started to really understand the atonement at the 6-month mark when I was at the Other Side Academy, when a lot of the drugs were finally, out of my system. And I was having to deal with all of these emotions that I hadn't been dealing with for so long. And the game changer for me, Maureen, to answer your question, was at that 6-month mark when I was finally able to overcome shame to the point where I was able to get back on my knees and start praying again and start connecting with a loving Heavenly Father and start realizing how much that I really was loved and that I really could overcome that shame. And I started to pray for my children, and I started to pray for the opportunity to hopefully be with them again someday. And so at the 2.5-year mark, when I graduated from the Other Side Academy, I was able to open that door, because at the Other Side Academy, we don't talk about therapy. We don't have family visits. We don't go to church. We just work on these horrible behaviors that got us there. And we can't do anything for our loved ones yet. We have to start over and build from the ground up this foundation. And for me, of course, that kept going into really leaning into the atonement and realizing what that could do for me. And so when I graduated from the Other Side Academy, the first ones in the door for me were my family members, and I was directed, just concentrate on your children. And thank goodness all 4 of my children, James and Emily and Mary and Michael, who's now on a mission in Madrid, all came back organically at their own pace, because I couldn't just show up and say, hey, Dad's back. It doesn't work like that. I knew I had a long road of doing the next right thing over and over again to where they would have enough confidence to start to trust me again as their father and family member. And my brother Matt and my sister Melissa started to be a bigger part of my life, and the Lewis side of my family, and a cousin Jeff Scott, and then friends started to come back. Family friends Nathan Savage and John Kimball, and just some incredible men. And I was a best man 4 times, and these 4 men have all come back into my life as well. Dave Sharp, Steve Gillette, Bill Brimley, and Jeff Harmon. And I just have had countless people start. If I haven't gone to them, they're coming to me. We've heard that you've gone through this incredible hardship and that you've overcome this incredible addiction and duplicity. And there's graduates of the Other Side Academy who are strong and doing incredible things, and they got me back. I didn't think I'd be able to even ski this year and start climbing again. And a graduate by the Other Side Academy by the name of Nathan Morris encouraged me. He said, no, don't wait. Try to do it now. And so I just spent a lot of time in the gym and training and trying to get my body back in shape. But the Other Side Academy, what they helped me with most was my spirit, because as broken as I was physically, when I got there the second time, I was 100 times more broken spiritually. Eventually, I was able to go back to church and had a great bishop and an incredible stake president, and they've just worked with me, and I just received my temple blessings this last month and was able to go back through again. And 5 years ago, I would have thought that would not even be possible. And so the Lord has just continued to part the Red Sea for me. And now to be able to tell my story and to go to the LDS 12 Steps Addiction Recovery Program of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and tell my story there or wherever I'm asked to go. It doesn't matter where. I just tell it pretty raw and uncut. I'm just so fortunate to have certain things in my past. And I don't talk a lot about my past or dwell on it, because I'm an addict. I'm a recovering addict. That's what I am. I'm somebody that has to look in the mirror every morning and say, James, what are you going to do to find a little humility today and to exercise humility and to not be entitled and to recognize that you had to do a complete restart, a complete reboot in life in every single category. And I could have never done that without the Other Side Academy having been created, and and I was too far gone. I needed something that hard.
I know you have so much more to say, but I did want to just hark back to one thing that really moved me and touched me, and that is that scene when you were leaning against the convenience store and you were just kind of completely lost. The description of yourself was amazing. And then to have your bishop, your former bishop, come to you and not know who you were, but you called out to him. And that embrace seemed to be, to me, like that was the entrance of the Lord into your life again, because he seemed to be his representative at that point in that moment. To me, is that ring true to you?
Absolutely. Every time I hear the scripture, knock and it shall be opened unto you, seek and ye shall find, ask and it shall be given you. I asked and the Lord gave. And that's how he gave it to me. He gave it to me in a form that I could immediately understand, how I was being blessed. So to be at this point in this process and to have been turned around by these people at the Other Side Academy and Bishop Meacham that helped save my life, and to recognize that that's all coming from a loving Heavenly Father and an incredible Savior in his Son, and to be able to apply the atonement like Maureen pointed out, that's been the salve for my soul. That's been what's started to give me enough spiritual confidence that I don't struggle with shame anymore. And it reminds me of an opportunity I had mountaineering many years back. We were climbing Mount McKinley with the Utahns on the Everest team, and 11 people died in the month of June 1992. And I was still a pretty hardcore adrenaline junkie, and I'd been training for that mountain for 6 months. And as I had the opportunity, my team kind of fell apart, but there was this awesome Russian climber from another team, and we decided to go for the summit together. It was a 3-week expedition, but he was such a better climber than I was. As we got near Denali Pass, he was ahead of me on the rope, leading, and the winds can sometimes, with wind chill, get to 70 below. It was a crazy hostile environment up there. And like I said, these people have been dying around us, and neither one of us were really affected by that. But he hit this pass before I did, and by the time I got to him, the wind had taken all the dexterity away from his hands as he was putting on some heavier ice gear and clothing. And so I said, "Are you okay? We need to keep climbing or we need to go down." And he said, "No, I'm okay." And so I went on lead, and I started to feel a dead weight at the end of the rope, and you can't ice climb like that. And so I eventually turned around and said, "Mecca, oh, what's going on?" And he said, "Oh, I'm just going to go down to these rocks, and there's this Japanese tent of those guys that died down below. So I'm just going to get in that tent. You can go for the summit," because he knew I really wanted to. And so I unclipped and I started to go for the summit. And I got about, I don't know, 20 or 30 minutes up that mountain, and I could see the summit ridge. And I had this incredible feeling come over saying, "James, you need to go back." And I really didn't want to. And so I kind of found a little place where I could kind of get on my knees, and I said a prayer, and I felt this overwhelming sensation. And it was my great grandfather, James Henry Moyle. And it was good. And the word was go back. And so I went back and I found him, and he'd broken some of his gear and dropped some of his gear, and he was a mess. He hadn't made it back to this tent. And so I was able to help him get down to this tent. But I recognized something at that point that happened is that I was not in charge. Something higher took over, and I know it. I know it. That's exactly what happened. I got him into this tent, and I had to go down because I didn't have a sleeping bag, and he did. And I boiled water for him, and I went down. And the next day he came down to me and gave me a chocolate bar and said, "Thanks for saving my life." But it wasn't me. Something higher had definitely taken over. And so I got home after that experience and was in the Tribune and the Deseret News and the Daily Herald and But Lee Benson from the Desert News is the one that got it right, because he said, that something higher had taken over, and that's what had saved this Russian's life, and that's what had happened. And so when I graduated from the Other Side Academy, and I'd been around all these people that had saved people's lives like mine, I wanted to try to see if I could do anything I could to feel that feeling of helping others, and that's kind of where I am now. And there was this incredible mountaineer by the name of Rene Damo that said, he was asked this question: "You cannot stay on the summit forever. You have to come down again. So why bother in the first place?" And this was his response. He said just this: "What is above knows what is below, but what is below does not know what is above. One climbs, one sees, one descends, one no longer sees, but one has seen." And this is the cool part about the gospel, the comparison. He said there is an art of conducting oneself in the lower regions by the memory of what one saw higher up. When one can no longer see, one can at least still know. So I was able to remember some summits in my past, going on a mission, coming from an incredible family, creating my own incredible family, having an incredible former wife and in-laws. And those were summits for me. And so as I went through the lower regions of being on the streets and finally making it to the Other Side Academy, I realized that summits were possible. And what I came to find out quite quickly was the only way that that next summit was possible was with the atonement. And that's my testimony. If we can embrace the atonement, that we can be saved. In Matthew 10:28, it states, "And fear not them that kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell." And I had to come to terms with what that meant for me, because I almost fell to the latter. In 2 Nephi 10:24, it says, "Wherefore, my beloved brethren, reconcile yourselves to the will of God and not to the will of the devil in the flesh. And remember, after you're reconciled unto God, that it is only in and through the grace of God that you're saved." So, Maureen, you hit the nail on the head. The atonement is what saves us, and it's what saved me. And Bishop Meacham, like I said, gets a little upset with me when I say, "Bishop, you saved my life." And he said, "James, the Lord saved your life." He said, "I was just happened to be in the right place at the right time." Just conference Sunday morning, and I'll end with this. And Sunday morning, I woke up and was doing my dailies. And when I read anything that comes from Harold B. Lee, I'll share it with Joseph and Selah. And that morning happened to be a quote from Harold B. Lee. And so I texted Joseph and Selah, and I said, "I love it when I occasionally stumble upon divine truth from a title holder to your sacred ground at 1436. President Lee said, "When finally we get that one divine thought that Joseph Smith was and is a prophet and the gospel is true, all the other seeming difficulties melt away like heavy frost before the coming of the rising sun." And I told Joseph and Selah, I imagine President Lee looking out the east windows of the kitchen built there, being the last house on the street, looking over the untouched wheat fields east up into the foothills, and him witnessing the picture of a peaceful, frosty morning and reflecting on his incredible testimony and writing the above words. "Have a wonderful conference Sabbath. I love you." And Joseph's response was this: "I feel his presence here at times. I know that sacred things have happened here. I also know that we were summoned to this place for you." I've been in that house many times. I used to go and administer to Sister Lee as a deacon, the sacrament. And I'm grateful for holy places today. I'm grateful to have been up at Snowbird today with two of my older children and to be able to enjoy the joys of life. Those are the great blessings today for me. I don't care about money and I don't care about prestige. I only care about the things that I can take with me when I leave this life, and that is my inner light and knowledge and testimony and my connections with my loved ones.
Thank you so much to James Henry Moyle III, who has been our guest today and told us this very poignant and earnest story. We are Scott and Maureen Proctor, and this has been Meridian Magazine's How I Know podcast. Thanks to Jenny Oakes Baker for the beautiful music that begins and ends this podcast, and to Michaela Proctor Hutchins, who is our producer. We thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.